So here's another misconception I've heard about Sass. I'm a designer. If I use Sass, it'll change the way I think and turn me into a developer. No, Sass isn't going to take control of your mind and turn you into a developer. But as we've seen, it can change the way you write CSS. Even though Sass does borrow features from certain programming languages, they're only there to make projects easier to build and maintain, like variables, for instance. Earlier, I mentioned how CSS can be repetitive. Well, Sass variables make the repetitive nature of CSS easier to manage because they let us store information that's reused throughout a project, like values for colors, font stacks, media query breakpoints, or any reusable CSS value. So now we can clean up our code even further with variables, because variables reduce a lot of the duplication in CSS declarations, and they also make our code easier to read. Now, I like to keep all my variables in a separate partial located inside the base directory. So let's create a new file inside our base folder, and we're going to name it _variables.scss. So before we move on, let's not forget to import this new partial into our style sheet. So we'll go over to the index partial, and we're going to import it at the very top. So I'm going to copy the base partial import, paste it right above it, and change the file name to variables. Now, we'll need to make sure that we are importing the variables partial first, since this will contain all the global dependencies in our project. So now I can go ahead and save index and close it out. And back in our variables partial, let's first create variables for color values in our project. Now, there are a lot of ways we can declare color variables, and you'll see tons of discussions and opinions on the web on how to write or structure these. So let's do what makes sense for our project here. So we're going to use a two-tier color variable method. The first tier will have descriptive color variable names, and the second tier will be the functional variable names. Overall, I think that'll be a pretty maintainable solution for us. So because of that, I sometimes use this pretty neat tool called NameThatColor for generating color variable names. And I've posted a link to it in the teacher's notes. So back in our variables file, let's first declare the descriptive variables. So we're going to add a comment for that. So let's type descriptive color variables. So first, let's declare the variable name white. And for this, we're going to use the hex value FFF. Now, right below that, let's write another descriptive variable name. This time, we'll write black. And for this, we're going to use the hex value 000, which is pure black. And right below that, let's do one more for gray. And for gray, we're going to define the hex value #878787. So next, instead of typing out the rest of the variables, I'll just go ahead and paste them below. You can also copy these variable names from the teacher's notes on the page. So right below the ones we just wrote, I'm going to paste in the new variable names. And in case you're wondering, these were color names generated by that NameThatColor tool I just showed you. So next, we're going to create a second set of variables that describe a color's function. So let's create a comment for that. We're going to say functional color variables. And for these variables, we're going to follow a specific pattern that makes them easier to read. So first, we're going to define the generic term they all share. So for example, color. And then we're going to write a more specific description. So for example, here, let's say color primary or prim. And as the color prime value, we're going to use the yellow-orange variable. So let's create one more. Let's say color secondary. So let's say color dash sec. And as the value for color sec, we're going to define the riverbed variable. And we're going to do the same for our text color. So right below the primary and secondary colors, let's say color text, and then let's find the light text color. So we'll say color text light. And as the value for color text light, we're going to use the white variable. All right, so let's do a couple more. Let's do color text base for our base text color. So we'll create a new variable called color text base, and the value for this will be the gray variable. And one more. So right below, I'll just paste in the color text prefix, and let's say color text dark. And for that, we're going to define the riverbed variable. So I'll just go ahead and copy it, paste it as the value. So once again, instead of writing out the rest of the color variables, I'm going to go ahead and paste them below, but you can also grab these from the teacher's notes. So as you can see here in the second set of variables, we can even use color operations for certain color variations, like we did here for the border light variable and the shadow variable. We used an RGBA function. All right, so now we can use these functional variables as color values in our style sheets. So for instance, let's go inside our layout folder and open up our header partial and replace some of the hex values with our new variables. Now, there's a handy shortcut in Workspaces we can use to find and replace values with variables. And that shortcut is Command-Option-F. And for Windows, it's Control-Alt-F. And the shortcut should also work in other text editors like Sublime Text. So if, for example, let's say this was a much longer style sheet, we could say we want to replace this hex value here with one of our variables. So we can say replace FFA949, and we'll want to replace it with that color prime variable, that yellow-orange color. So we'll say color dash prime. And once you hit enter, we'll say yes, yes. And as we can see, it replaced our hex value with our color prime variable. So next, we can also replace this hex value here with one of our variables. So let's say color body, which is white, as we can see here in the variables partial. All right, so let's save our header file, close it out, and do a couple more. So let's open up our base.scss file, and let's replace the body color hex value with the color text based variable. So we'll say color dash text base. So next, let's scroll down to the H3 and change the color hex value to the variable color text dark. And let's also scroll down and add variables for our link color values. So first, let's replace this RGB value here, which is actually just orange, with the color link default variable. So we'll say color link default. And right below that, we can replace the color light blue with the color link visited variable. And finally, in the hover rule, we can keep the RGBA function, but let's change these three values to the color link default variable. And it will still take down the alpha to 0.5. So I'm going to stop here, but you can go ahead and finish replacing the rest of the color values in our site with variables. And then I'll meet you in the next video.